morning. I'm going to spend the next few minutes providing just a high-level overview of some of the current data resources that are commonly used to study ADF opioids. But before I begin, I do need to correct a statement from the issues paper. The issues paper incorrectly states that the treatment episode data set, or TEDS, is a census of facilities that are licensed or certified by the state. The correct statement should read that the treatment episode data set is an admission-based system that includes data from facilities that receive public funds, are licensed or certified by a state substance abuse agency to provide treatment, or are tracked at the state level for other reasons. So, on to my talk. Oops. There we go. So the talk is broken up roughly into three sections. First, I'm going to give a very high-level summary of the current data resources, including some of the advantages and challenges when one is considering using some of these data resources to do research on ADF opioids. I will briefly touch on some of the general methodological considerations that we hope researchers are going to think about when they are planning these studies. And finally, talk a bit about the outcomes that are of interest to FDA and some of the issues that are around them. So this slide shows 4 broad categories of some of the most common data resources in terms of where the base population comes from and how the base population is selected. And as you can see, most of these come from convenience samples of varying sizes, with the exception of some of the federal surveys. This slide doesn't include smaller regional or cohort studies, and nor does it include state-based information, such as PDMP or medical examiner data. And while we're thinking about these data resources and the characteristics that I'm going to describe, I want to emphasize that I'm viewing this today specifically from the lens of designing and implementing ADF opioid research. Many of these data resources are used for all sorts of other things, and as such would have a different different challenge and different profile and have different uses. So these characteristics shouldn't be considered a kind of a blanket statement about these data resources in any field. So the first one, whoops, sorry. Okay, there we go. The first one is poison control centers. And these data are based on information collected from calls to poison control centers throughout the United States. There are over 50 such centers, so there's a very broad coverage area. And these data can often provide product-specific information and might include or capture individuals that would not otherwise interact with the healthcare system. However, if you are planning to do analyses in these data, you might need to think about the fact that the percentage of overdose or other adverse events that result in a call isn't really known. And the ability to distinguish specific formulations and brand names is not always clear or constant. And finally, severe overdoses or immediate deaths are unlikely to generate a call, and so if you're looking at those outcomes, they might be underrepresented in these data resources. Another consideration is that how individuals interact with poison control center data, what prompts a call, and what is changing over time, and it's not really clear to us how this change is affecting the analysis that we are doing. The second group are surveys of high-risk individuals, and these generally include folks who are being assessed for, who are entering treatment for substance abuse disorders. This can again capture a high-risk, hard-to-reach, population of high-risk individuals, and can also provide product and route-specific abuse information, which can be very valuable. However, it is difficult to define the underlying population that is captured in these surveys, and therefore it can be difficult to generalize analysis results to larger populations. It is also difficult or impossible to validate key pieces of information, since that data can only come from the person who had been misusing or abusing a specific product. So general population-based surveys, we define this category to include roughly two types of data. There's nationally representative data, such as the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, or Monitoring the Future. And there are also large convenience samples, and for those, an example of those would be internet surveys. Now, these surveys are often not focused on those who are specifically on the severe end or the higher risk end of the abuse continuum, but can capture those who are just beginning their abuse and might be just experimental or recreational or occasional, have occasional misuse or abuse of drug products. And some of these surveys also can capture specific populations that are seen as more vulnerable, such as adolescents or teens, such as in Monitoring the Future. And the last category is claims-based information. Now, these are most useful, obviously, for clinical outcomes such as overdose and death. They're less useful for the outcomes of misuse and abuse, although FDA has requested industry do studies that assess potential algorithms for measuring misuse and abuse create and validate potential algorithms to assess misuse and abuse in claims data. And this is part of a series of safety studies of extended release and long-acting opioids and folks who use those long term. Some of the things to think about, though, when you're thinking of doing studies with claims data is that almost half of the individuals with a drug overdose or other drug-related adverse event do not have a record of being dispensed an opioid. And because of that, you can't really assume that an opioid that was dispensed is the same as the opioid that was abused. And individuals, again, that come to the attention of the medical system might be anywhere. They could be experimental or recreational users, or they could be rather severe in their substance use disorder. And so the next part, and finally, I just wanted to mention a few additional data resources that can also provide useful information on specific topics. And these are alternative data resources, and they can include spontaneous adverse events, drug diversion data, and web-based resources such as those that collect information on street price. And these can provide very specific insights that can't be obtained through the more general and larger data resources, but it can be a challenge to relate these metrics to the specific outcomes and characteristics that are of interest to the agency. And also, since some of these data resources run on anonymity, validation and verifying specific factors can be an issue. So next, I just want to touch on a few methodological considerations that we think about a lot when we are looking at these data and trying to figure out how the effectiveness of ADF opioids. The first is exposure, definition, and assessment. This depends on the level of analysis. In group-based study designs, ecological studies, those are something that we see fairly common, and in those, the exposure, we consider that to be a unit of time or some other demographic. One of the things that has to be kept in mind in these kind of ecologic or group-based studies is that the individuals in the numerator may or may not also be represented in the denominator, which is generally a measure of drug utilization. The other half would be individual studies, where we might define the exposure as having possession of a drug substance, and the outcome is as misuse or abuse in some manner. However, it can be very, very difficult to disentangle the actual possession and the abuse, particularly if the data are gathered for other purposes beyond ADF opioid studies. The second issue is misclassification and ascertainment, and this can be a very important factor in trying to determine if an ADF opioid is actually having an effect on abuse. It can have fairly large effects on pre versus post-transition product identification, and an example of that is the Kleenex effect, where all drug, whether or not it is a brand or generic or or counterfeit or anything else is attributed to the brand name. It can also be affected by the data collection methodology, so the order that drugs are asked in and how drugs are identified can lead to varying levels of misclassification. So assessing the extent and non-differential nature of misclassification can be very important in understanding and interpreting ADF opioid analyses. And just as a last consideration, I wanted to bring up this nice simple slide that Dr. Staffa showed you before. And this slide is to highlight that there are many and varied routes to misusing and or abusing ADF opioids. And in addition, there are multiple data resources that can provide information on misuse and abuse, but they each capture a different part of the phenomenon, and they also vary in their ability to reliably capture outcomes of interest to FDA. And with that, I'm going to segue to the last part of my talk, which is actually to discuss the outcomes. So as Dr. Staffa mentioned in her talk, the outcomes of specific interest to FDA are misuse, abuse, addiction, overdose, and death. And since many of the technologies in ADF opioid products that we're asked to evaluate focus on non-oral routes of abuse, we are also interested in route-specific outcomes of misuse, abuse, addiction, overdose, and death. Now, while FDA has definitions of misuse and abuse, as Dr. Gottlieb described, operationalizing those definitions in a specific data source can be a challenge. Many of the data resources have differing definitions. Some combine the concepts of misuse and abuse, and these are just not amenable to medical terminology coding, so that can be difficult to measure in claims-based data resources. And often ascertaining a specific brand or formulation can be difficult or not impossible because it's unknown or the information is just not recorded on a regular basis. So addiction is a complex and nuanced concept. It's similar to misuse and abuse in that it is not measured well in clinical data resources. And often even the characteristics that make up addiction are not recorded well. So it's even difficult to create an algorithm. And finally, overdose and mortality are somewhat easier to define, but few data resources can connect misuse and abuse to overdose and mortality. And also, for example, in medical examiner data, it can be impossible to attribute an event to a specific brand or formulation. And in the case of overdose specifically, one can look at the exposure to a specific product, but overdose visits or deaths, again, cannot be product specific, kind of by definition. And a final couple of issues is that there's a complex and changing terminology around this whole area of opioid abuse, opioid addiction, or substance use disorder can all mean the same thing or different things depending on how they're used. Recent changes in the DSM from 4 to 5 and how these concepts are defined have also further complicated matters. However, to assist, well, somewhat to assist, to begin to disentangle the situation, FDA has asked industry to perform a series of studies that are based on chronic users of extended release and long-term opioids for chronic pain. And one of these studies centers around creating an instrument that will define and validate misuse and abuse in these patients and be able to use these outcomes and definitions in different types of data resources, for example, in claims. And lastly, I want to talk about some additional outcomes, such as doctor or pharmacy shopping measures, which again are represented in the extended release and long-acting post-marketing studies, and proxy clinical outcomes, such as hepatitis and HIV. And finally, drug seizure levels and changes in street price. Now, these are interesting and can provide timely information, but it is not always clear how they relate to, again, the outcomes that are of interest to FDA. And also, with the proxy clinical outcomes, They can be useful if they can be validated well, but they tend to require a very specific temporal sequence or circumstance. And an example of that is loperamide abuse leading to serious arrhythmias in order to be useful for us in studying ADF opioids. So thank you, and now I think we're going to move into the discussion.